Well, now to our interview. Dr. James Hansen heads NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Science. The institute has been publishing global temperature data since 1987 and is now one of the key sources of data for climate scientists. Hansen's own testimony to the US Congress in 1988 brought world attention to global warming. His latest book, Storms of My Grandchildren, carries the subtitle The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. He joined us from New York. James Hansen, thanks for joining us.
Sure, glad to be with you.
Now, you're accusing governments of lying through their teeth, even as they sign up to large emission reduction targets for Copenhagen. Why so pessimistic?
Well, it's very easy to show that they are either lying or kidding themselves, because all you have to do is look at the geophysical data. You know, the governments all around the world now agree that we're going to have to stabilize atmospheric composition, carbon dioxide in particular, at a relatively low level. And if you look at how much carbon there is in oil, gas, and coal, what you quickly realize is that oil and gas is already going to be enough to get us up to approximately the dangerous level. The only way we can solve the problem is by phasing out coal emissions and prohibiting unconventional fossil fuels like tar sands and oil shale. But in fact, if you look at what's happening, the United States just signed an agreement with Canada to make a pipeline to carry oil from tar sands to the United States. And Australia is expanding its port facilities to export more coal. And coal-fired power plants are being built all around the world. Oil is even being squeezed out of coal. So there's absolutely no way that the world can meet the kind of targets that they're talking about for future decades. So they're just putting out numbers, you know, goals which absolutely cannot be met. If you're going to use that coal, then you would have to tell Russia to leave its gas in the ground and tell Saudi Arabia to leave its oil in the ground, but nobody's proposing that, and you know they wouldn't do it anyhow.
You've also described the whole Copenhagen approach as fraudulent because of its, quote, ineffectual cap and trade mechanism. Now, why do you say global emissions trading won't work?
Well, we can prove very easily that cap and trade with offsets is not going to work. We tried that with Kyoto, and the global emissions actually accelerated. Even the rate of growth increased after the Kyoto Protocol. A few countries cut their emissions a bit, but as long as the price of fossil fuels is the cheapest energy, then they're going to be used by somebody. So this cap and trade and offsets, that's basically what this is. It's like the indulgences of the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church would sell forgiveness for sins. This was great for the bishops. They collected a lot of moolah, and it was great for the sinners because they got forgiven and they could still go to heaven, or at least they thought they could. That's what's happening in Copenhagen. Developed countries are coming and they're looking for these offsets so they can continue business as usual. They can continue their sinning. But developing countries, well, they're happy to go along with that if the developed countries will give them some money, you know, for climate adaptation or for the offset mechanisms, which if that will result in some money going to developing countries. So that's what's happening. You've got both parties making this kind of a deal, and who's getting the short end of the stick? Our children and grandchildren, because the emissions are not going to decline. In fact, they will continue to increase. That's as plain as you can see that very easily.
There's been a huge debate in Australia over emissions trading. Are you saying that even with the best will in the world, an emissions trading scheme in Australia will be ineffectual?
Absolutely. These cap and trade trading schemes are a terrible idea. You can see what they do. They they are a way to continue business as usual because they include these offsets, for example. They're not attacking the fundamental problem. Who they're good for is the big banks. In the United States, it's going to be Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, the trading companies. They have trading groups within their bank who are very skilled, and they're going to make money. And where does the money come from? It comes from the public. There will be increased energy prices. Big banks will make money, but the problem will not be solved. There will be very little reduction in emissions. Unless you attack the fundamental problem, you cannot solve the problem. And the fundamental issue is that fossil fuels are the cheapest energy. You must put a price on carbon emissions. And the way to do that, and to make it acceptable to the public and actually very beneficial to the public, is to return the money that's collected from a carbon tax, and that tax needs to be applied at the source, at the mine or the port of entry. You then distribute that money to the public so that they will have the money to invest in more efficient vehicles, in insulating their homes, and that would encourage innovations. Innovators would develop carbon-free or low-carbon energy sources. That's the way that you can drive the system to slowly phase out fossil fuels. But the cap-and-trade doesn't do that at all. And it's impossible as long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy. You're not going to phase them out.
Now, you've proposed what you call a uniform rising price on carbon, effectively a global carbon tax. Now, it's a simple approach, but it would require carbon tariffs to be levied against those who refuse to put a price on carbon. But isn't that a serious problem? Won't it lead to trade wars?
No, in fact, it is far simpler. As we saw in the Kyoto Protocol, you cannot get all the countries to agree. You have to bribe them one by one to try to get them to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol or a Copenhagen follow-up. But in the case of a carbon price, which is simple and honest, it's a much easier task. All you need to do is get the major players to agree to put a carbon price on. And then if any countries don't want to do it, well, then you put a tariff on the products that you import from those countries that are made with fossil fuels. And in fact, most countries would then decide, well, we would rather have our internal carbon tax because then we get to collect the money rather than the other country. That is much simpler than cap and trade.
Well, can we talk about the science of global warming and climate change now? Because as we've gotten closer to Copenhagen, the skeptics have become much louder. There's been a fierce backlash against the science. What do you think is going on here?
Well, the science, as you know, has become very clear. The evidence for climate change around the world is widespread. The Arctic sea ice melting, glaciers receding all around the world. Climate zones are shifting, the subtropics are expanding, and that's affecting Australia, by the way, as well as the southwest United States and the Mediterranean region. And that's a reason why we have more extremes, including heat waves and fires. But also, when we have rain, it is heavier because warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. We see the climate change all over the planet. There's no question about that.
But why do you think there's been a revival of scepticism against the science? You must have been disturbed yourself recently by the leaked email exchanges between your fellow scientists at Britain's Climate Research Unit. Now, skeptics are using these emails to support their case that scientists are trying to hoodwink us, that scientists are falsifying data or hiding away evidence that disproves their arguments.
Yeah, these are very desperate efforts by the contrarians and those who are supporting the business community that wants to continue business as usual. But you know, the data that is used to determine the temperature change over the last century or so, that data is available to everybody. If there was anything wrong with the analyses that showed the magnitude of this warming, don't you think that these contrarians would quickly